American. Well, all right, good morning or good afternoon, class. Good to see you. Hope you had a good weekend. Got to fix my tie pin when you know it. Let's see. There we go. Being a little silly this morning. Sometimes you got to do these things to relax. For after all, we are on what's called live TV. I would never make it as a news host because I get the jitters too much. But at any rate, I'm glad you're here, and whoever else is out there today is here. So we got, a goodly number of folks who take this class. I think there's about 69 or something, so there's just a few in here today, which is fine. But we have many in the hinterland out there taking this class, others who take it online and watch in asynchronous mode and all that. So anyway, there goes my tie pin again. So I'm wearing this because that mic pulls my tie. So anyway, well, okay, enough of the small talk. Today we're going to go to chapter 4. And we're going to talk about market failures, okay? So I'm an exponent of free markets. I think free markets is the way to go. I sure appreciate Adam Smith and David Ricardo and some of those folks back there who brought some insights to bear on this debate about whether free markets is the way to go, or should, would an economy prosper better, a macroeconomy, say, if somebody's at the center calling all the shots. So with free markets, we individually make, as suppliers and demanders, we make our own decisions. Much of the decision-making authority is devolved to the individual level, and that's a good thing for the most part. But today we'll look at some instances in which the free market may break down just a little bit, or at least not provide the optimal amount of stuff to be exchanged on the product or resource markets. There's, broadly speaking, again, two different types of markets. There's product markets, there's resource markets. Buyers and sellers come together, and in a market system, for the most part, there's at least little government intervention. There's no one saying, hey, you can only charge so much for that tire that you're making, Goodrich or Uniroyal or what have you. There's only so much you can charge for that, or there's only so many units you can produce, and so forth. But there are some reasons why government has to get involved in the free market. And so we have kind of a mixed economy, and we're going to be looking at that a little more today. I have distributed to everyone this little handout I made yesterday by hand. Hopefully you have this. Here we're going to firstly, before we talk about market failures, we're going to look at how we would quantify that failure, okay, and when it occurs. Just to give you, first off, a 35,000-foot view of where we're headed. A market failure, again, is when the market fails to deliver the optimal level of product or resource. And so a lot of times the easiest example, the most common example of market failure is when you have pollution. So you have a plant that makes those tires along the river, and they dump some sort of hazardous waste in the river. And what you see is that there's a cost associated with that activity that's not borne directly by the participants in the market. You may pay only $200 a tire, but then the person who's living downstream drinks the water, and they pay too, okay? And they're not a market participant. And so in that case, we see society as a whole may have a little different opinion as to what the real cost of making that particular tire is you bought, may be higher than you recognize as a consumer. And so from society's point of view, we're maybe producing too many tires. We're going to be looking at that today. We'll be able to put a dollar value on these inefficiencies that attend market failure. That is, when we overproduce or underproduce things, we can quantify the cost to society through a dollar sign there. We'll use a dollar amount there to quantify the cost that's associated with a market failure. But before we do that, we have to define some terms. And so today we'll talk about initially here, economic surplus. Okay, economic surplus is a dollar value really that we can associate with a market. And so we'll start with free markets first, and there's an example of a free market in your book. I'm trying to restrict my use of everything from the publisher at the moment. Long story, but at any rate, so bear with me if you will. Hopefully and I'm glad to see laptops here. When I refer to a page or diagram, you can look at that. But there's an example in your text of a market for oranges, bags of oranges. And I think you have on the demand side, you have 6 participants. They're listed on page 76 of your text. You have 6 consumers and you have 6 suppliers. So you can imagine these people showing up in a marketplace. Some have bags of oranges they've grown in their orchard this week. They show up at the farmer's market on Saturday. There's some who come to buy. And so there's these various buyers and sellers. So we're going to represent the supply side and the demand side of what's going on here. First off with this diagram, if we can go to the document cam here just a second. Okay, so what's going on here? Okay, so they have in your text listed these buyers and sellers, if you want, of bags of oranges. Okay, just to kind of get the point across. And so what we have, first off, they'll list here six different buyers. Okay, they give you the names here, so forth. But this could be Barbara and Bert and so forth. Bill and Bud and Bob. I'm using B's here, and I didn't get them quite in alphabetical order. But then there's another one here that's kind of hard to see, but we'll talk about these. It would be B6 here. So these are your individual buyers. I want to focus on this just a second because the idea here is that the market for bags of oranges at the farmer's market has equilibrated, has reached an equilibrium price of $8, okay? So how is that achieved, okay? Well, again, we've looked at that just a little bit. The downward and upward pressures that apply on a market price in the face of a shortage or a surplus. So we talked about that last time. If there were a shortage of oranges, the price of oranges is going to go up. So if you had a lot of people show up to buy oranges, not that many to sell, guess what? The sellers are going to command a high price. And the same would be true for a surplus, except in the opposite direction. But anyway, here are your buyers here listed. And I have drawn here what's called a demand curve. We're going to look at this in a little more detail to justify what a demand curve is here in a minute. We've talked about horizontal addition of individual demand curves, though. And we mentioned there that a demand curve is called a marginal, or is a marginal benefit curve. It's the benefit someone derives from consuming, buying and consuming a particular unit of good. So what's happening here? The first person, let's call this Barbara, B-A here, Barbara. The idea with Barbara here is that she would pay $13 for a bag of oranges, but she only has to pay the market price here. The equilibrium price is $8. Now, I don't know if you can relate to this or not, but have you ever been on the hunt for a particular item, say through garage sales or what have you, and you say, if I could just find that particular picture frame or whatever it is, I would pay $100 for that. And you look around, finally you find it and you see it for $60. I guess that'd be a pretty expensive picture frame, but let's just use that. So you would be willing to pay $100, but you find it for $60. And so, I mean, you get the sense of that you're getting ahead when you purchase something at a lot cheaper price than what you're willing to pay. This curve up here gives you demanders willing to pay, willing and able to pay for successive units of this good. So in that case, the example that I'm talking about there, someone would pay $100 for something that they only have to pay $60 for. So they make the purchase. It's like they stick $40 in their pocket, right? We call that consumer surplus. What is consumer surplus? Consumer surplus on any unit is the difference between what you'd be willing to pay and what you have to pay. Okay? And so that's a good thing. We like that. In a market, we like it. It's a good thing. It's a virtue of a market whenever you have lots of consumer surpluses. Not only for the first consumer, say we have here, which would be, what, $5? They're willing to pay $13 for an $8 item, bag of oranges. But notice the next one. So we have these consumers ordered in a certain way so that the one with the highest, what we call reservation price, sometimes you'll have that term used, the highest reservation price is ordered first, and then the second highest. So the consumer surplus here on the first item is $5, right? And on the second item, what would it be here? They're willing to pay 12, they only have to pay 8, so consumer surplus there is 4, okay? So you got $5, you got $4, I think you see where we're headed. Here, this is $3. That person's pretty happy too. They showed up on Saturday. They were willing to pay $11 for a bag of oranges. They only have to pay 8. And so forth. So what we're going to do, okay, so you see the last one. The last one, I'd have to zoom in real close because you can't really see them. This person here, B6, the one we're going to stop with here is the one who has a reservation price of $8 and an actual price to pay of $8. Okay, so they might be willing to pay $8.01, okay, but just over $8. So we're going to count them, but they only have to pay 8. So really, their consumer surplus is negligible. So what we can have here is something called total consumer surplus. I'll just say total consumer surplus, and it would be the sum of these individual surpluses here. So the first one was $5, so we have 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1. And this last one's 0. I'm going to include them so we don't forget they exist. And 5 plus 4 is 9, plus 3 is 12. I think this is $15. Y'all correct me if it's not. $15 would be total consumer surplus. So that's what CS is going to stand for here in our abbreviation. Okay, but you got another side of the market too. Okay, so come down here. These are suppliers. These are the people who grew the oranges, brought them to market. They're going to receive now $8 for each bag they bring to market. But, some of them have a lot more low-hanging fruit in their orchard than others. We've kind of talked about the low-hanging fruit principle a little bit and so forth. So some of these orchards, it's pretty easy for them to go out and pick oranges and bring them to market. Others, because of soil, the soil content and so forth, it may not make it so easy to grow oranges and so forth. So they have to throw a lot of oranges away and so forth. So it's kind of hard for them to bring bags of oranges to the market. So for other suppliers, it turns out that the marginal cost, okay, MC, marginal cost, the cost associated with each marginal unit brought to market could be ordered in an increasing way. All right, so the marginal cost curve here is associated with suppliers who bring successive units to the market. So the first one, man, they've got ideal soil, they've got good equipment and everything, good workers and so forth. So they receive $8 for a unit that particular unit only costs them $3. Okay, now we're not including here all the fixed costs to get set up and all that. They may have brought oranges to another market the day before and so forth. But this is for bags of market on this day to be brought to market. So the cost here is $3. So this is called producer surplus. Okay, so on the first bag of oranges here, first bag brought by this person here, it only costs $3 to bring in. That's the marginal cost. They receive $8. So the producer surplus on the first bag of oranges is $8. On the second bag, we're assuming we're making this simple. So each supplier brought a bag of oranges to market. We can generalize this more later. But the second bag has a marginal cost of $4. Okay, so again, we're tapping into an orchard here perhaps where it's a little harder to grow those oranges and so forth. So again, here you got 5, 4, I think we see 3, 2, 1. So we can calculate here, let's just do it here, total producer surplus. This is total producer surplus. Can you see that? Total PS as opposed to CS. And so again here, on the first one is $5 and so forth. So it's 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, 0. So this is $15. All right. So you have a total consumer surplus 15, total producer surplus of 15. It's good that those are big numbers. I mean, what that's saying is, again, consumers in the aggregate are $15 better off than what they'd settle for. That's kind of the way to look at it. Because each one of these people, if you auctioned off the oranges, okay, can you imagine auctioning them off? One person paid $13. So they just show up with a bag of oranges. Okay, and the gavel's there is about to come down. Who would pay whatever for this bag of oranges? Well, if no one knows that there's any more oranges coming on the auction block and so forth, they just look at that. Someone would pay $13. Someone would pay $12 and so forth. So the prices on an auction would actually be ordered up here on this curve. But it turns out they're down here. So consumers are happier than they would have to be and still buy the oranges. They'd still buy the oranges and pay a higher price, but they're $15 happier. Producers are $15 happier in the aggregate because they're getting to sell something for more than it costs them to bring to market. Now that would make you happy too, right? So if you were a farmer or what have you would think of that in terms of profit there. So if you add these two together, you get what's called total economic surplus. Total economic surplus. So the total economic surplus here is 15 plus 15, which is $30. Okay? Now, that's an important number to us. That's a number that we'll be using when we start talking about government intervention in the marketplace and so forth. But this is a measure of, if you will, happiness that is enjoyed by both sides in total of a free market. Okay? $15. So it's an amazing number. Now imagine for a moment if the government came in here and said, whoa, we don't like this for some reason, and they put a price cap on oranges. They say, you know, in fact, you get your congressman and so forth. I'm getting a little cynical, but we got to protect the poor people. It's terrible that we'd have oranges sell for $8 a bag. So the government comes in and says, hey, you can't charge more than $6.50 a bag. That would be called a price cap or a price ceiling. Okay, what's going to happen if the government came in and did that? Well, you would see that this trade here would not happen. There's a buyer that would be left out and a seller would be left out, and also over here as well. Buyers and sellers would get left out, okay? So you can't charge anything above $6.50. So you couldn't even charge, this one would get left out because it would be sold for between $7 and $9, okay? Now, okay, $8 would not be what these two could exchange for, but they could probably settle here at $6.50. So there's a buyer and a seller. It would make this exchange right here at $6.50. If you imagine if we could kind of scoot that line down a little bit, the buyer's certainly a lot happier, right? Their consumer surplus on that item is increased by 50 cents. They'll still buy. The producer's surplus is decreased by 50 cents, but they'll still sell, okay? They'll still sell, I guess it's decreased by $1.50. I said 50 cents, but this distance here would be from 8 to 650 is $1.50. So we slide that line down by $1.50. The producer is made worse off by $1.50. The buyer's made better off by $1.50 because of the price cap, but they'll still trade. Both are happier than they would be otherwise. So you have some units that would be traded, but then some units that would not be traded here because that producer, the one who brought the fifth bag to market, no way do they want to sell a bag of oranges for $6.50 when it has attached to it a marginal cost of $7. They're not going to do it. So in that case, the buyer or the seller's not going to come to market. They're not going to sell their oranges. We can play the same idea with price floors as well. We'll look at that in the next chapter when we talk about market failure. This is the failure that's associated, government failure. This is the failure that's associated with government intervention in the marketplace, okay? A little broader topic today, though, is just market failure. And so you'd have some failure here because there's some unhappiness going on. In fact, from society's point of view, if you start messing with this market and you're not inclining buyers and sellers to trade a total of 6 units in the marketplace, then there would be an under-allocation of resources to the orange bag market. There'd be too few oranges grown and sold, or sold and bought, okay? And so that would be an inefficiency. We call allocative inefficiency. Here we have a very efficient situation. This is achieved at free markets. You have what's called allocative efficiency, okay? Allocative efficiency is going to correspond to the outcome associated with a free market. So that means society is allocating just the right amount of resources to the production of what? Oranges, okay? Just the right amount. There's 2 different kinds of efficiencies that will occur right here at this quantity associated with the intersection of the demand curve, which is a marginal benefit curve, and the supply curve. See, I could bring this on down like this if I wanted to. But where those 2 curves intersect, if the market's allowed to operate at that price and quantity, you have 2 types of efficiency. This is a very important one here, allocative efficiency. The other thing is you have productive efficiency. I'll guarantee you the producers here are not going to desire to waste resources in bringing oranges to the market. So they're going to sell a bag of oranges for $8. Guess what? They want to produce those oranges as cheaply as possible, okay? So, you know, if just a few oranges, they're not going to bring out the cherry picker and all that to get these oranges at the top of the trees and so forth. So that's called productive efficiency. You have 2 types of efficiencies that occur here at the intersection of the supply and demand curve. Okay, so now let's think about this a second. What if, I'm going to just kind of play around with the camera here and say, that's as far out as I can go, but what if we really brought this out? Instead of there being 6 bags of oranges traded, what if there were 6,000? And I tried to do this, okay? 6,000. So the deal is, I think you'd see I'd have to back off on this picture, and these rectangles would seem to be very thin, right? Very thin. At some point, you have what would look like, kind of like if you smear a deck of cards or something like that. The rectangles are extremely thin. So that this situation here would approach a continuous case where you wouldn't really see these regions right here, okay? And so what you would have really in a larger market is a situation where, you would just simply have a supply and demand curve like this. Supply, whoops, I'm sorry, looks like my ink pen quit me. Supply is here, right here, and demand, right? And there's your quantity. Okay, so these 2 intersect at PEQ, equilibrium price and quantity. And, we could try to draw these rectangles in if we want, but at some point, really the area, total area of those rectangles equals the area of this triangle. And the total area of the rectangles down here equals the area of that triangle. So you kind of think in these terms. If you ever take an infinitesimal calculus course, differential calculus, something a lot of students have had that, you look at Riemann sums, and the limit is n goes to infinity, and you find the area under a curve. It's kind of the same idea here. All right, but at any rate, in this case, total consumer surplus is simply this area here, equals the area of that rectangle. You use an integral sign if you want, so forth. But and then producer surplus, total producer surplus here is this here is also an area, but it's the area of this rectangle. Okay, pretty easy. How do you find the area of a rectangle? 1/2 base times height. All right. So that's where we're going to start first. If you get in nonlinear situations, so if you had a lot of suppliers, say, whose marginal cost for the first unit they bring, or a supplier who brings several units to market and they're all at $3, then this curve would be horizontal for a while and then it would take off. So what we see is we're starting somewhere with linear supply and demand curves. In that case, you'd have a nonlinear supply and demand curve, but you got to start somewhere, okay? So let's look at an example like this, okay? So tell you what, let's start out here with a market I want to describe. This is kind of similar to a problem we looked at last time. Here's a market, another market for oranges. Instead of bags, I'm going to measure this in crates. Okay, it doesn't matter. But at any rate, here's the demand. Demand for oranges here in a week. You always have to have a time preference. I mean, the demand over a year is greater than over a month and so forth. So at least it's got to be implied what the unit of time is. I'm going to say 1800 minus 400 P. And the supply here is Q equals 200 P. So this is demand, quantity demanded. This is quantity supplied. So, I mean, here's a market for oranges. And the idea is we want to, let's find total economic surplus. Okay, so total economic surplus. How much joy is shared by producers and buyers, potential buyers of oranges here, because they're able to participate in a free market. All right, I kind of want to look at this a little bit because we did one last time where we had a supply and demand curve and given algebraically, and we found the intersection or equilibrium point. But really what I gave you there, I gave you the inverse supply and demand. I expressed P in terms of Q because that's the way they did it in your text, but it could be given either way, okay? So you might have another problem stated this way where Q is expressed in terms of P. Actually, this is a natural way of doing it because remember, your independent variable is what? P. Independent variable is P. The dependent variable is Q. So it's like we treat P like we normally would X and Q as we normally would Y. So I've got Y solved for in terms of X here, okay? You know, at least from a logical point of view. Now, from a graphical point of view, that's not what I have here. Because in other fields of study, we put the independent variable on the horizontal axis. Here, we put it on the vertical axis. So I just want you to see here that, I mean, we could express, and I think you should be able to do this, express the inverse supply and demand. The inverses, okay? So in other words, take the demand curve and solve for P in terms of Q. So I could do that, you know, what would I have to do? I'd have to add 400 P to the left and subtract Q. And I'll drop my Q for a minute here just to show what we're doing here. But, or quantity demand. So I'd bring this to the right and this to the left, right? Plus 1800. Hope I didn't throw anyone. So P is 1 over 400 Q, and there's a negative there, plus 1800 over 400, which is what, 4.5, I think. Okay, so I guess I could put this in decimal form just to show you here. This is a negative 0.0025 Q plus 4.50. You know, this would be the inverse demand, okay? This is the inverse demand. I just took the demand curve and reversed I just solved for P in terms of Q. And I could get the inverse supply as well. Okay, how would I do that, class? Well, I'd take the supply curve and I would solve for P in terms of Q. Well, that's pretty easy to do there. P is 1 over 200 Q. So if I divide 1 over 200, I guess I get 0.005 if you want to do it that. Okay, so this would be an inverse supply and this would be an inverse demand. It'd be easy to graph, okay? Because we got P isolated in terms of Q, and we got, when we sketch these things, P on the vertical axis. So we're used to that, okay? 6 of one, half a dozen of another, but sometimes we find it easier to sketch the inverse demand, the inverse supply curve. Notice the inverse demand has a negative slope, has a vertical intercept of 4.5, right? Y equals mx plus b. So there you go. Okay, this is the demand curve. Okay, you got P on the vertical axis, independent variable this time on the vertical axis. So this is 4.50, and it has a negative slope, and we'll just note that here. So I drew it this way. And then the supply curve, this is like y equals mx, the b is 0. So it goes through the origin, right? Supply, demand, there you go. So, well, okay, big deal. But we care about, when we want to find total economic surplus, I need to be able to take this region right here and find the areas of each of these. Because I want to find total consumer surplus and producer surplus. So I want to find those separately and add them together just as we did. Okay, so, all right. So you wouldn't have, like say, if on an exam I say, tell me the total economic surplus, you might do this, you might not. I wanted to do it though here today, so you see that there's reasons for working with the inverse supply and demand. They're easier to graph because of the way we're accustomed to graphing lines. But at any rate, this point right here is all important to us here. It's the point of intersection between the supply and demand that will demarcate here the consumer and producer surplus region. So I'm just going to go back up here, back to these. You can work with either set. Let's find equilibrium. Find equilibrium. So at equilibrium, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied, right? These two things would have to be equal. So that would say then that 1800 minus 400p is equal to 200p. So 1800, is 600p. And so p is 1800 over 1600. Now let me just write it this way. Over 600, which is $3. Okay, so the equilibrium price here is $3. Okay, so here's your equilibrium price. Equilibrium quantity is found by back substituting this into either one of these, doesn't matter. So we could back substitute that into the supply function. And this would be PEQ, QEQ. So this would be 200 times 3, which sounds like 600. Crates, okay? Crates, it's equilibrium quantity. This is dollars per crate. That's our price, dollars per crate. Okay, so we can label that point we're just looking at here. This is the point $3 and 600. Okay, so it should be a pretty straightforward thing now to find total consumer surplus and total producer surplus and then add those together, okay? So let's do that. Let's just say, okay, well, okay, so consumer surplus is this rectangle right here. I said rectangle, I think that's called a triangle and 3 sides. So it's 1/2 the base times the height. I'll write the formula here for this one. 1/2 BH. Y'all remember that from high school, junior high school, grade school geometry. I don't know, 1/2. Okay, just keep it upright. 1/2 the base is 600. 600 crates. I mean, you can write the word crate in there if you want the units you're working with, crate. And then the height is this distance here. That's $1.50. So that's $1.50 per crate, okay? Now what I want you to see here is that the units here cancel, crates cancel. So you multiply these together, and I think you get $300, don't you? 300, is that right? I believe that's right. $300. How come that doesn't look right to me? Should, okay. Yes, it is. I don't think that's right. 1/2 base times half. 1/2, 600 times 450 can't be that. So I think I have and this I should be able to do in my head, but let's just do it here. 0.5 times 600 times $1.50 is $450. So I don't know what I was thinking. Let's say $450. $450. Okay, there we go. So notice the crates cancel here, so you get $450 for total consumer surplus. Remember, producer surplus now would be the area of this rectangle down here, 1/2 base times the height again. So now the base, again, is 600. I dropped my units for a moment, but the height here is 300. And so 1/2, 600 times 300, I think it's $900. You know, if I make a mistake, well, I think you got the idea, but sometimes I just don't see something. But at any rate, this is consumer surplus, this is producer surplus. So you add those together, you get $1,350 for total economic surplus. Okay, here's your total economic surplus. $1,350 is enjoyed by the participants in this market we described here by the supply and demand curve, because they're able to come together and freely exchange at a price that's mutually satisfactory for each one of them. Okay, mutually. So no one really, I mean, the market's going to clear. That is to say, you got a situation like here where the quantity supplied, distance to the supply curve, equals quantity demanded. So there's no leftover oranges, there's no surplus of oranges, there's no shortage of oranges. There's just the right amount traded at that price. We'll put a happy face here, because the bigger that number is, the better. Now when the government comes in, as we're going to see, or some other things happen that we'll consider in this market, because we're only looking at buyers and sellers of oranges here. Could be other people affected here, or some things we're overlooking. But this is a measure of happiness that's enjoyed in total by the two sides of the market. So that's the value of economic surplus, okay? So they do some calculation in your book as well. Now, one thing I want to make sure we understand or remember here is when I drew these two curves here, supply and demand, we have a notion of what these are now. Supply is a marginal cost curve. It's a marginal cost curve. So each of these people who bring bags of orange or crates of oranges to the market have to be compensated at minimum by the marginal cost to deliver. So that was their minimal acceptable price. So again, here the first one who brings a bag of oranges to the market has to have $3 or they're not going to show up. Okay, and then it's going to go up from there. Marginal cost increases. There's a law called the law of increasing marginal cost. We've talked about this a little bit. Also, increasing opportunity cost, but it can be, in common parlance, we could call it the low-hanging fruit principle. You always, these orange growers, they're always going to pick the low-hanging fruit first. So those first few bags that are brought to market come at a lower marginal cost. Now, guess what? I mean, if the equilibrium or the market price if there was a price floor enacted for oranges to guarantee that orange makers will receive $10, okay, and that may seem kind of artificial, but this sort of thing happens all the time. You have price supports in agriculture. Guess what? There'll be a lot more people grow oranges and bring them to market because the marginal cost will be compensated by a higher price. But this is a ubiquitous law here. It's called the low-hanging fruit. The first few units are cheaper. Now, in a manufacturing situation, I mentioned last time about efficiencies that can occur in a factory. Remember, let's go back to that just a little bit. And if you have 4 workstations, 4 workers might produce at a lot cheaper rate or might be able to produce units of output that are much cheaper than 2 workers would, and so forth. If we go back and look at that, and we will in a little more detail, there are instances, many instances, where marginal cost can decrease at first. Okay, and just kind of an aside, a marginal cost curve can do like this, but eventually because it's a short-run cost curve and there's a fixed input to production. Eventually, it's got to increase, okay? So that's what we care about here. Marginal cost curves will eventually increase. Now, this demand curve is a marginal benefit, and it slopes downward because of decreasing marginal benefit. I mean, this is a ubiquitous law as well, decreasing marginal benefit. And what's the deal here? You can imagine for the moment, and I used the word auction a while ago, but if these oranges were auctioned in a marketplace, the highest bidder is going to get the first bag, okay? And then the auctioneer says, guess what? What's behind door number 2? Okay, so they open, well, behind door number 2, there's another bag of oranges, wouldn't you know it? And so it gets auctioned off, but not at such a high price. Because the one who values the first unit the most is the one who's going to get it. Now, we can put this on an individual level as well. If you eat oranges in a week, that first bag's better than the second one. If you eat pancakes for breakfast and you tell that waitress, waiter or waitress, say, I want a bunch of pancakes today. I heard they're pretty big here, so bring me a pancake, I'll eat that. Boy, it was good, you had syrup on it. And you're still hungry, you say, I'll bring me another pancake. Well, guess what? We all know this. The second pancake's not quite as good as the first one. You'd be willing to pay more for the first one than for the second one as an individual. And also in a collective, this will be this case, okay? So the first unit that is sold in the marketplace will go at a higher price than the second unit. Pancakes, whatever it is. So at some point, though, the marginal benefit goes to 0, okay? It's like, I don't want any more pancakes. If I eat any more, you'll have to take me to the hospital. And that's where marginal benefit becomes negative. All right, so some concepts here I want us to just be familiar with and so forth. Economic surplus. And at this point of intersection here, you have 2 types of efficiencies, productive efficiency and allocative efficiency. And your book talks a lot about allocative efficiency, where the supply and demand curve intersect. You're allocating the right amount of resources to the production of this good, whatever is measured on the horizontal axis. And your book gives you 3 conditions for allocative efficiency. What are these 3 conditions for allocative efficiency? Okay, 3 conditions for allocative efficiency. Very important. 3 conditions for allocative efficiencies. The first one, your book says that marginal benefit must equal marginal cost. Marginal cost. That last unit that's traded, must have a marginal benefit equal to the marginal cost. Anything less than that, you've underproduced. So if we don't allow for this trade, the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, and that means there's somebody wanting to buy another bag of oranges, but they can't find one to buy. So if you underproduce, marginal benefit exceeds marginal cost. Okay? If you underproduce, here's supply and demand. In other words, I'm saying if you produce here at Q1, not at PEQ or QEQ, but at Q1, guess what? The marginal benefit's up here. The marginal cost is down here. This is supply and demand. Okay? Marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. So you got people wanting to buy more and they can't. Boy, I'd love to have more oranges. Well, there's not any more here. Okay? Well, why not? Well, the government came in and put a price ceiling on oranges. So this is what you get into with low rental apartments in New York City and so forth. And I told the story when I moved to Washington, D.C. I was 25 years old, just got married, went there, only been up there for a job interview and so forth. And I thought we could just go up there and get an apartment. And lo and behold, for what we could afford at the time, there was shortage. And you get into that a lot when there's price ceilings, and you have that in rentals. But what if you overproduce, okay? Here's supply and here's demand. Here's QEQ. Again, I'll put it QEQ. But what if now we overproduce. So maybe the price is set here. Okay. So that the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. But notice something, the last unit here, I'll call this Q2, the last unit here has a higher marginal cost. Remember, this is a marginal cost curve, has a higher marginal cost than a marginal benefit. Okay, if you shoot past the equilibrium quantity so that, the quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded at this price up here, and then if you measure this way, you'll see that the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit. So only at one point here will these two things be equal. And that, at that point, is basically saying the last unit that gets traded will be valued at the price it gets traded at. That's a good thing. Second thing, the maximum willingness to pay equals the minimum acceptable price. The max willingness to pay, okay, the maximum willingness to pay equals the minimum acceptable price. Okay, so we see that, say, on this last unit that gets traded here. Here they're talking about that last unit. The maximum willingness to pay on that unit equals the minimum cost that would have to, or the minimum acceptable price. In other words, for this unit right here, the sixth unit, the minimum acceptable price to the orange grower is $8. The minimum acceptable price to the seller of the sixth unit is $8. The maximum anyone's going to pay for the sixth unit, say imagine these being auctioned off again one at a time, is $8. The last one that's going to, say, be sold, if you order buyers and sellers in the order of their reservation price, for sellers or buyers here, is such that that last one is going to be valued at what it's just enough to cover the cost of bringing it to market. So the maximum willingness to pay is on the demand side. The minimum acceptable price is on the supply side. And so those two are going to equal right here for that sixth unit. So that's the second condition. The third condition is that total surplus, again, this is consumer surplus plus producer surplus, is a maximum. No way to make it any higher. So this is that total surplus that we're talking about here. When I sketch this thing right here, it kind of looks like it's a big triangle. Think of that's a pizza for a minute. Think of that like a pizza. Okay? Now, we're going to see a bully comes in later called the government. Government has different ways of coming in and getting part of that pizza. All right? But right now, that triangular pizza is being enjoyed by society. It can't be made. It's the biggest it can be. So what's neat, again, is that we can put dollar values, like we had $1,350 associated with this situation right here for the total consumer surplus, $1,350. When the government comes in, say, or something else happens and diminishes that total economic surplus, we can quantify the cost of that intervention and with a dollar value. That's a neat thing about looking at these issues that we'll be looking at. Okay, so you got an idea of what economic surplus is. Any questions? Anything on this? All right, so the title of this chapter was Market Failure. So, all right, so where are we going with this initially? We're going to talk about why you don't have this allocative efficiency achieved here. And so there's a couple of instances here. So first thing is we're going to talk about externalities. Externalities. All right. Market failure can be due to the presence of something called externality. externalities. There's two types of externalities. Let's see here. There's negative and there's positive externalities or third-party effects. Okay. So what I mean here, an example of a negative externality is pollution. Okay, now this fact of externalities, that this diagram that I've been drawing here does not represent everybody who bears a cost or enjoys a benefit from each unit brought to market. This doesn't include everybody. Because it doesn't include everybody, then this economic surplus is not really the surplus that would be applicable to society as a whole. This is the surplus that's applicable to market participants. But there are some people who don't participate in the market. So I gave you an example earlier, say with pollution. So you have people who drink the water downstream from the factory that makes the tires on the side of the river. They bear a cost too. So let's think about that a second. So with pollution, there's all kinds of pollution, right? Okay, so this is just kind of a general head here, if you will. What you have here with a negative externality is that there are some people who are not represented in this diagram. This is a private supply curve or marginal cost curve. This is the private supply or demand curve. The thing is, with externality, pollution and so forth, the cost of each unit that's brought to market is really higher than what's pictured on this curve. It's really higher than that. So really, you have a marginal cost curve that's up here. This is the total marginal cost. Your book uses S sub T for total supply curve or total marginal cost of production. This includes everybody now. So does that make sense? When you have a negative externality, pollution, you have people who are paying the cost, bearing the cost of production, not represented by the private side of the market. So let's add their cost on too. So this is an instance where here I kind of shift the curve up. I talked about shifting curves left and right before, but I shift it up here because what I'm doing is I'm tacking on a price to each quantity that we haven't considered before. Price for each unit. So that shifts this curve up a little bit. So no longer is QEQ at this high level. Okay, when I say QEQ here and PEQ, this is a private equilibrium. Now, from society's point of view, this unit, the last unit traded should come at a higher price. Okay, this is PEQ, I'm going to call this prime. Okay, and QEQ prime. Can I come down here? Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, from society's point of view, we've been every week making these tires, trading them. That's the example here. We've been overproducing. And buyers have not been paying the complete price because that last unit that's traded went too cheaply. It did not cover the additional cost imposed to someone external to the market. So there's overproduction. Overproduction. Okay? And it's overproduction because of this thing here, a negative externality. Now, with a positive externality, okay, pollution's just one. I mean, there's lots of other negative externalities we could talk about, but we're just kind of, that's kind of the most classic example there. But the supply curve does not capture all the costs legitimately associated with production, okay? Does not capture everything. There's additional costs. So when I put MC per T, I'm including costs that I've neglected before. Positive externalities is different. Let me draw a supply and demand curve, okay? Supply and demand again, here we are. Now, positive externalities, these are good things, okay? I've talked about here in the past how you getting an education will have spillover effects for society. So imagine for a moment you're here and you're paying for all your education. Maybe this is a private school and tuition's $500 an hour and you're just paying that. Okay, so we'll make it real simple here. But really, when you get educated, and you don't have to be a brain surgeon to do this, whatever it is you're going to do, the idea is that as you become a productive citizen, you're going to produce good things for society. Okay? So really, I mean, this is the rationale for subsidies for education in general, but for public assistance to you or me and going to school is because you're going to do more for society than what you're receiving right now in sitting in the classroom. So there'll be third-party effects or spillovers due to something positive here. You may come up with a cure for cancer or something like that. Thank you. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time. Thank you for letting me know. Okay, so what's the deal here? Okay, so the idea is this curve down here, marginal benefit, does not fully capture all the benefits enjoyed by society. The private marginal benefit curve doesn't really tell the whole story. Positive externalities would be represented along a demand curve here, which we'd call MC, marginal benefit in total. I'm going to put a T here. They use a T here, okay? So from society's point of view, the marginal benefit of production is up here, okay? So you would have to shift the market demand curve up to get society's demand for the particular good. Say it's higher education, what have you. So in that case, QEQ is to the left of QEQ prime. Okay, because society says, hey, we want more of that. And we're going to see a way here in a minute how society kind of encourages that, like for instance with Pell Grants and so forth. They're going to school, but we create more of this quantity that's traded by subsidizing the good. We'll see that in a minute. It's going to be the opposite of what we do over here. So society wants to be here. They value the good at a higher equilibrium price than before. So here was PEQ. Now it's up here. But the point is on the horizontal axis here, we get underproduction by the free market. Just looking at the free market itself. The free market is not achieving, in either case, the output level that leads to maximum total happiness or surplus across the economy. Here, we overproduced, so there's this what's called a deadweight loss here. This is called a deadweight loss, DWL. At deadweight loss means there's lost economic surplus. There's economic surplus that should be enjoyed here that's not because trades are not happening as they should. Okay? I'm sorry here, I said that wrong. Too many trades. I was thinking of this one over here. We're overproducing, so the last few units, the last few tires made by the factory along the river, be nice from society's point of view. If they could cast a vote too, they'd say, don't make those tires. They're making us sick downstream. Okay? So you have overproduction, and we can calculate the cost of that externality by finding, what do you think, the area of that triangle. Over here, you have economic surplus that's not being achieved because we're underproducing. So this is the size of a, missing surplus because we're not valuing, the market's not valuing the goods as much as they should. So this also, a lot of times for a positive externality, we may not use deadweight loss, the term, but I'm going to use it here, deadweight loss as well. Okay, so hope that kind of makes sense. I got this in the wrong place. I'm sorry. It's not right. I'm sorry, class. It's right here. supply, and demand is up here. So if you'll take your white out, I'm sorry, class, I drew that in the wrong place. There's your additional economic surplus that would be enjoyed if the demand curve truly represented all preferences in society amongst consumers. So this is what kind of makes this a little tough for me, but there's a picture of this for you. Let me just say here, and I might get fired for doing this, I don't know, but that's all right. There it is right here in your book. Okay. So, positive externalities, you forget about this, would like to include it. Negative externalities, you forget about this. Okay. All right. So at any rate, what we want to look at here is we want to look at how can government intervention, how can the government come in and encourage the market toward these values, these quantities that maximize total economic surplus across buyers and sellers. All right, so here's the deal. Generally, if you want less of something, what would you do? Tax or subsidize it? If you want less of something. So if you have you're going to tax it, right? If you want more of something, you subsidize it. So if you have negative externalities, you want to tax. That's one way. It's called a Pigovian tax. Your book talks about it a little bit there. Add a little extra to the cost that has to be compensated by the demand side of the market. So you add a little bit to the cost that somebody's got to pay if you want fewer tires produced and sold by the tire plant. So if you do that, the idea here, if we zero in on a negative market failure, can we? There we go. So the thing is, if the market's here and we want it to be here, then what we do is we impose on the private market a cost to one side equal to the externality itself, the cost of the externality. In other words, we apply a tax. Okay, your book talks about this a little bit, a corrective tax. That's one way. Another way is the government can just come in and say you can only produce a small amount of tires. Okay, that's called a direct control. But generally we apply a tax. So each one of those tires, we put a tax on that. Say the suppliers, they produce these things, and or if it were oranges again, if we went back here to our little diagram just to make it where we can understand it, and then what if there were a tax on oranges? So we could tax the supply side. We could say, hey, these oranges are bad for our health. That's kind of wild, isn't it? But we could assess a $1 tax on each bag of orange that's brought to the marketplace, a $1 tax. Okay, because we want to be above and to the left for society's sake than where the market is. Maybe it takes there's a lot of noise in growing oranges. I don't think there is, but you could have noise pollution. Lots of things, okay? So we're producing more tires, more whatever it is, than society values. What do? We tack a tax on, say, to the supply curve. We bump the marginal cost curve up by a tax equal to the size of that negative externality. This is called a Pigovian tax, okay? Your book talks about that a little bit on page what is this, 83 of your text. A Pigovian tax is simply a tax here on the supply side. So you got demand, you got supply. Society wants to be here. Okay? So how do we incline the market to produce here? Well, we tax, T-A-X, to bring the private supply curve to a total supply curve here that represents all the costs associated with society. Okay, so this is called a Pigovian tax. Pigovian tax named after Arthur Pigou is actually the way you pronounce his last name, but they leave off the U, I guess, and call it a Pigovian tax. A Pigovian tax is one way to correct for negative externalities. Is not the only way. Let's list the ways to correct. That's two ways, primarily two ways to correct for a negative externality. All right. The first is direct controls. The government comes in and says, you just thought you were going to bring this many tires or oranges to the market, but we're only going to let you bring this many. Okay? That's a direct control. Secondly, or they may have some other way of achieving this. Okay, you may have to have a license, okay, or something to grow oranges or whatever. But then the Pigovian tax, I'll just say a tax in general here. A per unit tax that's equal to the size of the externality. Okay? You'll get this a lot with in the government, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. By the way, if you don't think the EPA has got a lot of power in our society, just go to Washington, D.C., walk down Constitution Avenue from the Capitol to the Lincoln, and look to your right. Somewhere along the way, you will see the EPA building, which is huge. Lots of people work in that building, and they write regulations and so forth for how our economy works. So, you know, it hits every area of our lives. The list is endless. You may be a farmer and you think, hey, I want to put a pond out there on my land. Sometimes it's not that easy. Sometimes if you change the area of surface water in an area, the EPA gets involved. Just stuff like that. These would be direct controls, just saying, okay? If you want to dam up Cootie Creek in Bartlesville and make your own lake, you're probably not going to have an easy time doing that. Just lots of things. I'm glad there is an Environmental Protection Agency. I'm glad there's a Food and Drug Administration. I'm glad there's a Consumer Product Safety Commission. These things. I'm glad somebody at the meat packing plant, at least once in a while, comes down and looks at those carcasses. The old picture is the meat inspector has a cigarette in one hand, and they're looking at the carcasses here. But somebody checks that once in a while, because I just soon not get botulism. Okay? So there is a role for government here and so forth. But if whatever it is, if it's whatever we're producing has a negative externality associated with it, then one way the government has of dealing with that, correcting for that, is with direct controls. Okay? Okay. Now, how about for a positive? What's the government? How does the government intervene when there's a positive externality present? Well, there's a couple of ways here. All right, so here's the market, supply and demand. So you got supply and you got demand here. The problem with a positive externality, of course, is there's not enough of whatever it is we're producing. Okay, so I mean, I mentioned public education, but if you're an environmentalist, you may think we should have more heat pumps. Well, used to be a subsidy on it. You put a heat pump in your house, you build a house, put a heat pump, you get a tax credit. A lot of times tax policy is constructed in such a way as to provide subsidies for those things we want more of. So you have tax credits for heat pumps and tankless water heaters and those sorts of things, or for EVs, electric vehicles, okay, without getting into the specifics on that. Or the government will subsidize producers, not just demanders, but also producers of goods like electricity. So an example, and my wife and I, we drove across Texas Panhandle just recently, and there must have been 1,000 of those like this, thousands of them. I couldn't believe it. It's been a while since I've driven across Texas Panhandle. Well, what's going on? The government is subsidizing that industry. So you can make payments to the demand side, say payments to you as a student, because we want more education. We may give you some money to go get vaccinated, because there's positive externalities associated with being vaccinated. You know that? I'm not trying to get controversial here, but if you get vaccinated and you get vaccinated and you get vaccinated for whatever it is, I may not have to get vaccinated. Okay? I could be a free rider. You see how what you're doing can affect me in a positive way. And there's some of these diseases haven't been around for many years for which we don't even vaccinate people for anymore. Boy, if they ever came back, smallpox, something like that. I don't think I've had a smallpox vaccine. My parents did. I know my mother did because she had a little scar right there. Where'd you get that? I remember asking her, that's my smallpox vaccine. I don't think I got that. Well, guess what? I'm benefiting from something there. So the government may encourage more of something by providing a subsidy to those who receive the good. And why? Why do we want to do that? Well, because it's good for society. And it's been good for us that, we provided vaccines, or we provided education, we provided heat pumps and so forth, EVs, I guess. So we could go down the list. So you can subsidize either the buyer or the seller. So the point here is, let's go to the dot cam here and make sure we get the point. The idea here is we want more of this stuff. Okay, we drew the picture just a moment ago. Again, it was positive externalities on page 81. What the deal is the total demand exceeds the private demand. You got the same thing. If you paint your house, your neighbor benefits from it. It may cost you $1,000 to paint your house. Boy, sure needed it. Guess what? Or you plant a flower bed. Your neighbor's going to benefit from that, okay? So at any rate, from society, or total benefit here from society's point of view, we want more of this thing. How do we do that? You subsidize. You can either subsidize demanders. Oops. It looks like it's stuck there. I don't know. Or producers. How do you do that? Well, if you subsidize demanders, okay, you can do that with a subsidy to consumers. Subsidize consumers. When you do that, you're basically shifting the demand curve up. You realize here that demanders, if they receive a subsidy, will now value... I think we're experiencing technical difficulties. Are we still on the air? Okay, we're good? Okay, thank you.